Good morning. I'm Eric Jacobson with iConnection, a website design and web marketing company, and I'm the founder of Manufacturer Insights. I'm pleased this morning to have with me Mike Roberts, who is a consulting partner at Expense Reduction Analysts. Good morning, Mike.
Good morning, Eric. Thanks for having me today.
Oh, absolutely. I'm excited to hear about what you're going to speak about. The topic today is cost optimization, how to unlock the door to reduce supply chain expenses. So before we dig into the topics around that, Mike, could you tell us a little bit about expense reduction analysts and a little bit about yourself?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks for the question there. So, Expense Reduction Analysts is the largest cost optimization organization in the world, believe it or not. So, we've been around since 1992. We started in the UK back in 1992. We expanded here to the United States and North America in the early 2000s. And so at this point, there is about 1,000 consultants worldwide, and we're in 45 countries. And so that's a little bit about ERA and who we are. And me, myself personally, I came from a finance background and I fell into an accidental hospitality world, right? And like most folks in the hospitality world, I was a general manager and regional director for 20 years in the hospitality world. So I was on that other side of the table where I was running businesses, I was optimizing expenses, I was doing supplier negotiations and driving high profit margins. And I decided to take that into my own business here about 2 years ago. So that's how we got here today.
So before we talk about creating that culture of cost optimization and some of the ways that manufacturers can unlock cost savings, let's set the groundwork a little bit. Tell me, when you go into manufacturers, what kind of things are you seeing currently? When you walk in, what is it that you're seeing in their operations?
Sure. The things that we're seeing consistently across the board are really twofold. One is labor is an intense area of challenge in the manufacturing space, right? Most folks are either have many open positions that they're looking to fill and are having a hard time doing so, or they're fully staffed at the moment, but there's been so much upward pressure on wages, right? And the hiring environment has been so competitive that they've shrunk margins as a result. Unfold. The other aspect is all the other aspects of operational costs have increased dramatically over the past 36 months since really COVID started in 2020. So that's pretty consistent across the board, what we're seeing in the manufacturing space. And really in that area of, let's say, 25 to $100 million organizations, we're seeing a pretty significant opportunity for optimization and controlling leakage in those non-core expense areas within the business.
Okay. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned labor. We in Manufacturer Insights realize that's such a hot topic. We've had some virtual events in the past on that topic, and we'll continue to focus on that. But I'm going to turn it over to you and let you take your keys and help unlock some of the doors. So
Great.
Go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Yeah, and the goal for today is really just to try to shed some light on supply chain optimization and supplier cost optimization. And my goal is that folks can walk out of this presentation today a little bit, A, more aware of how to go about it and what's the key components, and B, perhaps able to put some of these best practices to work in their own business, right? One of the things that I always say is if folks can do this on their own, I always encourage them to do that, right? Versus have someone else come in and do it. In the situation where they don't have the time to do it or the expertise to do it, there's certainly other resources out there, but my goal is to arm folks with the knowledge to move their business forward, right, internally. So that's the goal for today. Really where I wanted to start it today is getting started. How do you do step one of optimizing your supply chain? Then I wanted to go into a little bit more of the intricacies about understanding suppliers, understanding their markets, why that's important. Talk a little bit about RFPs and best practices and why that's important in this process. Really what suppliers don't want you to know, right? So what are the internal knowledge points that most businesses don't have about suppliers in their industries? And then I wanted to wrap up today just talking about the expense management continuum. So what does ad hoc look like? What does good look like? What does exceptional look, right? And I think that will bring us about to a close here this morning. So
That sounds great. Let me ask you, who in a manufacturing operation are you speaking to? Who should be thinking about these things? What are those roles?
You know, ideally, it's the entire organization. It's a culture of cost optimization that gets implemented throughout the organization. That's ideal, right? But a lot of organizations don't have that structure set up, so we have to create that culture. We're 90% of the time we're starting with the president, the CEO, the owner, the founder, right? And then from there, we may be working with either the COO or the CFO. But that's just a sponsor, right? The key is getting all the stakeholders in the organization involved, right? Everybody has to align with these initiatives. It can't be the top-down approach. It's got to be all members coming together, and with that, all boats rise, right? That's key.
Yeah, I love that you talk about a culture. We had a virtual event on change management and ERP implementation, and that whole culture of change was mentioned. So there's a common theme here. Go ahead.
Great. Yeah, with that said, I'll dive right in. Step one with supply chain optimization and cost optimization is similar to, I'm sure, what you would see in any other area, right? Whether you're talking about marketing, Eric, which I'm sure is your area of specialty. The first thing you have to do is you have to have a plan. You have to commit, you have to develop a strategy and a plan to optimize expenses, right? Without that, there's really no jumping off point. So that's step one, is commit to it. Step two is to really analyze your actual purchasing history. So what does that look like? Pull out your general ledger, pull out your accounts payable by supplier, look at a rolling 12 months data. Something as simple as taking your GL and creating a pivot table and bucketing it by expense category or supplier, and actually seeing what down to the individual supplier your annual expenses are, a lot of times is eye-opening for folks, right? A lot of times that's not an everyday or every year activity that you do. Yes, you may see the profit and loss statement every month, but that doesn't tell the full story. So that's really step two, is analyzing your actual purchasing history. And many times folks see, and what we see is, it's not what businesses think, right? So develop a strategy, really analyze that purchasing history. And then the third step is one that I think sometimes gets overlooked as well. And that's really looking at the qualitative factors, right? So nowhere in cost optimization is it simply a cost or a price in a vacuum, right? That's one component to cost optimization, but quality, service, operational fit, that always has to be the primary factor when you're looking at cost optimization, right? Anyone can go out and trade down on a lower priced good or service, right? But does that lower priced good or service still fit the need of the organization, right? That's the key, right? So perhaps getting a more value-based approach with similar service, similar quality, similar operational fit is always the key. So what are those qualitative needs? Is it a certain amount of customer service, right? Is it having customer service available 24 hours a day from that vendor? Is it a certain shipment drop time or size or minimum, right? There's many other factors involved. Really make sure that you go through it and you evaluate and you understand what those qualitative needs are before you go out and you look at alternatives, right? So that will be step three. Step four is to understand your buying assumptions, right? Have they changed? When you signed on with a vendor 2 or 3 years ago, have the requirements that you had in place when you brought in that vendor in the first place, have they changed? Are they still appropriate? That's a critical part as well, because many times those items have changed. Then the fifth step, and this is the critical step here, is to really put out an RFP, right? So you can include your incumbent supplier and also other suppliers in the marketplace that should be vetted, that should be of similar quality and service from the qualitative needs that you set out. But going through that RFP process is the next critical step in the process to make sure, A, your current suppliers are at market level and to benchmark them against other suppliers, and B, make sure you have the right vendor in place, right? Is there another alternative there in the market that can serve your needs at a better price point? So with that said, I wanted to touch on what some of the RFP best practices would be. Okay.
My let me jump in with a quick question just on
Please.
something that you said. What recommendations do you have, or how have you dealt with a situation where any business doesn't like to rock the boat? So there's definitely opportunity available, but there may be resistance to change vendors or to change a process. How have you dealt with that in the past?
That's a great question. So change is always hard, right? That's probably the number one thing that you have to overcome in this process. But I will say that 60 to 65% of the time, there is no change in vendor, right? You're able to achieve anywhere from 15 to 25% savings with your current incumbent supplier. So why is that the case? You signed a contract 3, 5, 7, 10 years ago, right? At the time, it was at market rate, right? They're servicing your account well, you develop a relationship, you become to trust that vendor, and then every year there's a 3 to 5 to 7% increase. And that happens consistently year over year. And when you have a vendor that you like and trust that's providing good service, you don't shop that vendor out, or you don't renegotiate that. So before, after 5 years, 7 years, maybe even 10 years, you're out of line by about 20 to 30% within the market, right? So going through this process can create that correction. Even if you have a supplier that you're happy with, you can go through this process and get those savings with your current incumbent supplier. So let me say that step one is there doesn't have to be change. If there does need to be change, the key is making sure that, as I mentioned earlier, is all stakeholders are involved in this process from the beginning. So if there's a purchasing manager, if there's a department manager that oversees this vendor, they're all a part of this process. They understand, A, why are we doing this? They understand, B, what's the financial ramifications? And they understand, C, that from a qualitative perspective, and if this vendor is going to meet their needs. Yes, we maybe have to purchase a different way or order a different way, right? There may be some samples that need to be tested to make sure quality's there. But at the end of the day, this is going to help move the business forward, right? So I think that's the key one.
Good answer. So thanks. We'll continue with the RFP.
Okay, so yeah, we were talking a little bit about RFPs and what are the important factors when you're executing an RFP. So step one is really just making sure it's clear and understandable. Does it have specifications, forecasted volumes annually? Do you include questions in that RFP that you want to hear the response of the vendors, and making sure that you're doing the same questions for each vendor that you're presenting the RFP to? Is there a price list included, making sure it's a like from that you're looking for? Are you allowing alternatives, right, when the RFP is being completed by the vendor? Those are all questions that you want to think through and ask before you're putting together the RFP. You want to collect info for non-price factors, making sure you're capturing the total cost. So you're not just looking at the cost of X material or X item. Are you also looking at switching costs, delivery charges, volume discounts, rebates? All those factors tie into the overall cost of change, right? So it's important that they're factored in. And I think this is far and away the most important part of going through the process of RFPs. Working with incumbent suppliers or new suppliers is treat vendors and suppliers fairly, right? Treat them with respect, treat them as a partner of your business. It's not about beating up the vendor. That's not the way to get the best outcome, the best price, and the best partnership from a supplier. And treat them fairly, treat them all the same, have them all respond to the same list of questions, and remove emotion from the process and just really deal with facts. So I think all those items are key to executing an RFP.
Yeah, one of my favorite questions, either that people ask me or that I like to ask when I'm working with a contractor or whatever, is what didn't I ask you that I should have? Or what do I need to know that I didn't ask? And I listen to the way that they respond to that question, how forthcoming they are with information, how well they think outside of the box to help help me solve my problems. So that's just a strategy that we use, and I'm sure you could use as well.
That's a great point, Eric. Yeah, 100%. We deal with the same type of questions, and that's a great question to ask. One thing that I didn't touch on that I skipped over that I did want to go back to that I think is really important with this process is, prior to getting to the RFP process, understanding suppliers and their industries, right? So this is a critical step that you don't want to miss right before you go to the RFP process. So do you understand that supplier and their industry before putting together the RFP? ideally you want to know that market and that supplier like your own business, right? Many of us don't, right? We know our business, but we don't know our supplier's business. That's critical to doing this process well. So spend the time and do some research. Look at market trends, look at pressures, look at cycles within that industry. Are there any new developments, alternatives in that industry? Understand terminology and jargon. Speaking in the right terminology and jargon when dealing with vendors and writing RFPs will produce a drastically different result, right? It's the perception that you're knowledgeable about their industry that allows them to put their best foot forward, knowing that, because at the end of the day, suppliers will charge what they can get away with. That's just how it goes. So them knowing that they're dealing with an expert in that industry and business is going to afford you the best opportunity to get the best result.
Hmm.
Do you understand the cost, the price drivers in their industry? Have you done any benchmarking for similar companies with similar spends and similar geographies? All important. And then another key factor is, what is their true differentiator among their competitors? Why are they different? Why are they unique? Right? I think all those are key points. So thanks, Eric, for letting me go back to that. I think that's an important area to touch on before you actually dive into that RFP process, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Okay. Great. So we've come up with our qualitative needs. We've done our analysis. We've put a strategy together. We've understood our suppliers. We've gone out to market. We've done our RFPs. We get our RFP responses back. At this point, the key is to be decisive, to understand that you don't have to take the first offer, right? There can be conversations. You can go back to suppliers and vendors after you get the first RFP response. But the key is to implement quickly. A lot of times RFPs don't have, do have an expiration date, whether it's 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, right? So you want to work quickly to make sure that you implement, you make a decision within that time frame, and that you realize those savings, right? There's been countless times I see there's an RFP on the table for some percentage of savings or large dollar amount, and people just move slowly, right? Every day that's lost, you have to realize, is savings lost, right? There's an opportunity cost for that time. So obviously you want to make a good decision. You want to involve the stakeholders, but you do want to move decisively. You want to stick to a timeline, and you want to make sure you implement it in a timely manner. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think
And if I could just say, I think, again, just dealing on the other side of this, encouraging that dialogue. So if you're a manufacturer, you send out an RFP, you whittle it down, going back and having that kind of deeper conversation allows you to uncover things that maybe the person responding to the RFP didn't understand one of the requirements, or as you were saying earlier, the ability to discuss alternatives. By having that dialogue and being open to doing that, and as you said, developing a partnership, you can even uncover even greater savings. I know in our case that happens by having the dialogue and letting them perhaps brainstorm some other things, but it doesn't happen just through electronic communication. You have to have that dialogue. Yeah,
so a follow-up call after you get the RFP response to talk through things. Was there any point of clarification that wasn't clear within the RFP, right? That's a key step, right? To have that communication after the RFP, not just putting a bunch of sheets of paper side by side, making the analysis and coming up with a decision, right? There's more to the process. Great point, Eric. I want to go through a few misconceptions and challenges. What suppliers don't like, or what they assume that you do not know as a business working with vendors going through RFPs. I think the key to understand is that suppliers don't always give the same pricing to similar clients and customers, right? We may assume that's the case, but that's simply not the case, right? Supplier loyalty can translate to complacency and allow margins to increase. A lot of times businesses assume loyalty is a good thing, and that gives them the best pricing, the best terms with a vendor. That's not always the case. Strong arming suppliers may lead them to start with higher pricing, right? At the end of the day, suppliers are human, right? And they want to work with people that they feel will be good partners for them, right? So that's something we have to keep in mind when we're going through this process. Contracts can help you get lower pricing, but they can also lock you in during a down economy. Renewal clauses should be carefully reviewed. So depending on what phase of the market you're in, you may want to be conscious of term length, right? If you're at the peak of the market as far as pricing is concerned, and you anticipate that the market may change down the line, or you may see some price reprieve moving forward, you may want to look at a shorter term, right? Renewal clauses is something that I see come back to bite businesses all the time, right? They're not aware of their auto renew clause in their contract. They miss the auto renew time frame in their contract. Next thing, they're not locked into another year or 3 or 5 years, and they're not aware of it. So I would recommend one of two things: either being very aware of what your renewal clause is in your agreement, or simply have those removed from your agreements, right? Many times that's something that you can negotiate out when you are going through the contract process.
Great point. Hadn't thought of that. The
Yeah.
ability to remove that renewal clause.
100%. It's very negotiable. And it's just something that suppliers put in by default. And unless you ask to have it addressed or removed, it's just by default in the agreement. Yep. Group purchasing organizations. So this is something that not everyone's aware of or not everyone participates in, but GPOs or national price agreements are organizations that typically folks assume will translate to the best possible pricing for the organization. But what we see is that's not always the case. So just because your organization's in a GPO or a national price agreement, that will not always translate to the best possible price for you. So you want to still make sure you're going through the process of regularly doing this cost optimization process, even if you are in a GPO or national price agreement. And the final point that I want to share is something that we do for each of our clients, that what I see across the business world, not just in manufacturing, across every industry, is businesses are not taking the time to review their invoices, right? So an invoice comes across whoever's desk, they sign it, they approve it, they send it to accounts payable. No one, or very rarely, are folks pulling out contracts or making sure that they have that level of knowledge to really go through line by line in that invoice to make sure it's correct before they're sending it out for payment. As a result, what happens is there's price creep, right? A vendor will increase prices slowly over time. You may not notice. They'll assume you won't notice. There's leakage within the organization. There's special fees, there's environmental fees, truck charges that were not agreed to that show up in an agreement halfway through the year. No one questions, no one notices. There's more leakage there within the organization. Obviously, not everyone has time to go line by line and pull out contracts for every invoice, but it is critical to make sure that there's a process inside the organization to review invoices for accuracy. This is how tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, even in some cases millions of dollars, seep through in an organization, right? So that's a really critical step to understanding your suppliers.
So Mike, we spoke about something you call the expense management continuum and the different aspects of kind of what is considered best practice in expense management. I think it'd be helpful if you would walk through for us the 3 phases of, or 3 aspects of the expense reduction continuum.
Sure. Yeah. So I think this is a good discussion to tie in this entire presentation and put a little bit of a bow on it here. If you go through this process that we've touched on from step 1 all the way through this current conversation we're having here today, the goal would be to end up in the area where you are exceptional from a cost optimization standpoint, right? So I just wanted to briefly go through what those steps would look like on the way to exceptional. So many organizations we walk into, we would consider in the ad hoc phase, right? So what does that look like? There's no understanding of spend. There's no competitive bidding happening within the organization. There's no review of invoices, right? So that would be the ad hoc, the baseline level of cost optimization. And then the next step up, a better arrangement for cost optimization in an organization would be there is some management of core expenses. There's some market knowledge about the vendors and their industries. And there's a basic knowledge of contract details happening from a management level, right? That is a better scenario to make sure that their costs are being optimized. Then the next step up would be what we would call a great scenario, where there is some competitive bidding happening on a regular basis. They're spot checking invoices for accuracy. And there's an understanding of basic non-core spend, whether it's pulling out GLs on an annual basis or looking at AP by supplier. There is a level of transparency there in non-core spend. And then exceptional. If people have gone through and really mastered this process, all expenses are being managed. Spend is being regularly analyzed. There's utilizing category expertise, and they're incorporating non-price factors into RFP, right? So it's not just about the price that we mentioned, it's about all qualitative, operational fit, all core areas of that vendor relationship are going into RFPs when they're conducting that process. They're creating competitive tension, right? That's not a negative thing when working with vendors, right? To make sure that they're getting the best possible outcome for their business. They're cultivating supplier relationships. So even though they're going through this process and they're doing an RFP process, they're managing their non-core expenses, they are treating their suppliers as a true partner in their business, right? To get the best possible outcome for their business. They're monitoring every invoice. There's a process in place where each invoice is looked at line by line with someone that has knowledge of supplier relationships and contracts, and they're getting approved, they're getting questions when there's errors, and they're getting credits when credits are needed, right? And they're tracking and measuring savings. So they're looking at, after they've gone through an RFP process, when they're getting revised bids back, they're looking at actuals that are happening on invoices, and they're going through and saying, okay, how much am I saving year over year in these expense areas through these vendors? We know what we track and what we measure is typically what we're able to move forward. So that would be an exceptional scenario to managing cost within an organization. So hopefully this provide a full overview to help folks to get at least started with optimizing expenses in their organization for those that may have not. And for those that maybe have started this process, hopefully it gave them a few more tips, tricks, and things to be aware of to continue to move towards that exceptional area.
So it's interesting. I had a meeting yesterday. Something you said made me think of this. I had a meeting yesterday with a large business, and one of the reasons they called in a marketing agency is they have neither the time nor the expertise to be able to manage their own marketing. And I think what you touched upon, one of the things that was most impactful to me that you said was when you're negotiating with suppliers, really understanding their industry is one of the keys. And I don't feel that unless there's a dedicated purchasing person in a manufacturer, I don't think they're going to have that level of expertise to be able to do that themselves. Which leads me to the question, if I'm a manufacturer and I feel that there's some opportunity, if I were trying to hire somebody, an outside resource to help me manage this process, what should I be looking for in hiring a company to do that?
The first thing I would want to make sure is that they have a level of expertise in the area where I see a need within my business, right? If I'm aware of a pain point or an area of need within my business, if I know, hey, I need help in freight, or I need help in operational supplies or MRO or merchant processing, whatever it may be, I want to make sure that expert I'm bringing in is not a generalist. They have expertise in that specific cost area within my business. I think that's critical. If I don't know where the areas of opportunity are within my business, I'd want someone that's very holistic, that has the ability to evaluate my entire organization and has the breadth and depth to be able to look at the entire business. What I see is many times in our world in cost optimization, there are people that have very defined niches or areas of specialty, but they don't have the breadth to look at an entire organization and still have specialty knowledge across that entire organization. So that's what I would want if I had someone coming into my organization to help.
Mike, something that I think would be helpful, you had shared a slide with me that shows some examples of typical cost savings that have been achieved. And what is also really interesting is the different areas where those savings can be realized within an operation. Would you be willing to bring up that slide and speak to it?
Of course. Of course, yeah. I have a recent manufacturing example here. It was a manufacturer that we had worked with, and we really looked at about 5 different key non-core areas within their business to help deliver savings. So the 5 key areas was really in MRO, chemicals, packaging, small package freight, and in freight, and truckload, less than truckload. So in MRO, we really looked at 3 key areas. There was general MRO, oil and lubricants, and furnace belts. And we did a combined savings where we were able to uncover a combined savings of 901,000 for 22%, 235,000 through general MRO, 510,000 through oils and lubricants, 156,000 through furnace belts, which all combined to that 901,000. So that was a really large win for that client, with a 22% number there. On the chemical side, we had a pretty staggering result from a percentage standpoint, saving the client 47% in chemicals, all at a similar or better quality, mind you, with a $660,000 savings in chemicals. The other core area was packaging costs. We were able to find a new supplier, and we also were able to keep the current incumbent supplier. So through a mix of a new supplier and the incumbent supplier, we were able to find 460,000 savings in packaging, which is a 15% savings. On the small package freight cost side, we were able to find savings of 273,000. We analyzed and priced over 800 delivery points for a 13% overall savings. And then on the freight side, on truckload and less than truckload, we found 9% savings, which still equated to a large dollar amount of 251,000. And we looked at the transportation management system employed for optimal carrier selection. We did an auto audit, and we looked at process improvement there. So overall savings for this client were in the approximate $2 million on an annual basis. And this drastically moved the organization forward. So I wanted to share that recent example with everyone today.
That's pretty remarkable. Now, as far as your involvement, what was the time frame that it took to realize all of that savings?
To realize all those savings, it took between 2 and 3 years overall, right? So we typically do a 24-month period for each project. Now, not every organization can do 5 projects simultaneously. We are happy to move as fast as the client would like. We could do all 5 at one time. The client chose to phase those projects in over 2 to 3 years.
So that's a pretty big number, but I would imagine any size manufacturer can find savings. It may not be that large, but that percentage savings, I would imagine, is available to most manufacturers at any level.
So we, as I mentioned at the beginning, we've been doing this for 30 years. So we have over 30,000 successful projects to date under our belt. Our lifetime average savings for every dollar reviewed is 20%. So that's been consistent over about 31 years.
So of course I have to ask, so what didn't I ask you that I should know?
Yeah, no, I think you did a great job, Eric, asking questions. And I think this was helpful for folks. I think the important thing to know is that wherever you are on that continuum, it's a good place to get started, to get better, whether you have no experience optimizing costs or whether you're all the way at the end of exceptional, you can always be better. And just focusing on this area of the business is so impactful. If you look at top line revenue versus bottom line revenue, right? If you're to increase top line revenue, if you're to focus on revenue generation, to get that revenue to the bottom line, think about how many different cost areas it has to go through in that organization to make it to the bottom line in net profit. If you're looking at non-core business expenses, if you're able to free up any savings within non-core business expenses, many times that goes 1-to-1 to your bottom line to net profit, right? So if you're looking at areas to focus within the organization, it can't be ignored to focus on non-core expenses.
Good point. Mike, thank you. I appreciate you joining us this morning.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks for having me. This was fun.